And welcome to today's webinar, Naked and Exposed, Stop Investigating Online Without Managed Attribution. Thank you for taking the time out today and being here. My name is Julie Banley and I'll be your moderator. I have some housekeeping items to go over before we start the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and the on-demand will be sent to all registrants in a few days. In your webinar console, you will see various widgets. You can hide, minimize, and resize these boxes as you see fit. I would like to call out a few actions you can take. In the bottom left, you'll see the Q&A box. Submit your questions here at any time during the presentation, but we will answer all questions at the end. To the right of your slides, you will see the resource list. This is where you can download a copy of today's slides, as well as additional resources you may find helpful. We have some upcoming webinars, and you can register using the three boxes below your slides. The first is a continuation of this webinar, Naked and Exposed Part 2. Use the registration button to join us May 13th, while we will cover managed attribution best practices and look at real-world investigations to see how managed attribution can make or break the mission. The second webinar is April 29th, Part 1 of our Intro to the Dark Web series, What's Hiding in the Dark? We will discuss what the dark web is, why investigators should be on the dark web, as well as the risks. Lastly, we have a webinar next week, April 22nd, specifically for our trust and safety audience. In this introductory webinar, we will cover investigation best practices unique to trust and safety teams. You can register for one, two, or all three of these upcoming webinars. So on the upper right side, you can request a demo of Authenticate's managed attribution solution. This won't take you away from today's webinar, but allows you to be able to let us know if you'd like to schedule that demo. Lastly, there is a quick survey to complete at the end. It takes about 1 minute, and your answers help us improve our webinars. And in fact, our three upcoming webinars came from your suggestions. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Matt Ashburn. Matt is the Head of Strategic Initiatives here at Authenticate, a former CIA cybersecurity officer and national security CISO at the White House. Matt also brings 17 years of government and private sector experience focusing on intelligence matters and cybersecurity initiatives. For those of you joining us, welcome to today's webinar, Naked and Exposed, Stop Investigating Online Without Managed Attribution. Thank you for taking the time and being here with us today. Let's get started. Over to you, Matt.
Hey, thank you, Julie. Thank you, Julie. Great to be here, and thanks for everyone for joining us. We have a great crowd, so we're going to go ahead and dive right in to the content. Like Julie said, this is entitled Naked and Exposed. That's actually a really, really great example of what we're going to talk about today. If you're investigating online, if you're doing online research, if you're conducting criminal investigations or legal research, anything that involves investigating things or researching things online, you don't want to feel naked and exposed, right? And we're going to help you with that today. So there are hundreds of thousands of people right now that are online doing investigations and research of some type, right? And within the United States, we estimate that there's probably roughly around 1.5 million people that conduct some kind of online research, some kind of online investigation. And that means millions of investigations, millions of research topics every single day. And this spans many different sectors of government as well as the private sector, everything from open source research and intelligence to cyber intelligence, cybersecurity, law enforcement, trust and safety teams in the tech sector, and even academia have to conduct some kind of online research. And we want to make sure that that's done in the most effective and safe manner. So to kick things off here, we have a lot of people here in the audience. I'm going to ask a poll question here to kind of keep this interactive because it is a virtual webinar. Why do you conduct online research today? You know, what are some of the topics, or what are some of the reasons that you're going online today to conduct research? So if you would, there's a poll that should be coming up on your screen. Feel free to submit responses there so we can discuss and have some customized content related to the topics that interest you. Because again, you know, this is important, right? Because the skills that we're going to teach today and the risks that we're going to inform you about today apply regardless of your sector. It doesn't matter if you're an academic or if you're an attorney or if you're a fraud investigator or a law enforcement officer. The same risks apply online, and we want to make sure that you're aware of those. So as we look around, so we have a pretty good number of responses now, and we look at the results here, and it's pretty interesting. We have wide applicability for the information that we're going to present today. As you can see, there are quite a few people here, and that spans everything from open source research to financial fraud, even law enforcement and cyber intelligence, right? People across the board do some kind of online research for various topics and for various reasons. And regardless of the sector that you're in, you need to do so in a safe, secure manner. So today we're going to cover how online research tactics can compromise investigations and also what to do about it, right? That's an important piece of it. We're also going to talk about pitfalls of using things like VPNs and private browsing or incognito mode. Depending on the situation, you may try to reduce your risk by using those, but they also come with some hidden risk and some false assurances as well. We'll also talk about terms that you may have heard, such as non-attribution or misattribution, and also introduce the concept of managed attribution and why that's important. So out there on the internet, lots of resources available for anyone doing research. Again, it doesn't matter if you're doing investigations or law enforcement or academic research, right? We're just going to call it research, right? Because regardless of what you do with the information, you still obtain it online. Lots of resources out there, everything from social media to search engines, maybe commercial databases and government databases, even public records, right, that are out there, and also the dark web. That's another important resource that's out there for us. And these are very commonly used. Again, regardless of your industry or your vertical, you have a need to get to this information. And as investigators, when we go out to these sources to get information, we want that information to be accurate. And we also want the fact that we're obtaining this information to remain confidential. That is, we want to protect our research, our investigations, and our analysis. We don't want the targets of our investigation or targets of our analysis perhaps to become informed of our investigation prematurely. Right? So an example there is if you're a law enforcement officer and you are actually investigating someone, you don't want the suspect necessarily to become aware of the investigation prior to you wanting them to be aware that they're being investigated. We also want to protect ourselves and our organizations. And by that, I mean, we access lots of content, as we said, online, and we want to make sure that that content doesn't harm our organizations in some way. That can be malicious content that's there, and also there's a chance for potentially retaliation against our organization or our agency if the suspects or targets of our investigation become aware that they're being investigated. And so we face a lot of challenges, right? In trying to obtain this information online, we may have IT policies within our organization or IT filtering that may block access to certain websites that we need to get access to. We also may have requirements for documentation and chain of custody. And we, of course, want to obtain as much information as possible without alerting the suspect or the target of our analysis. Again, also, untrusted content and risk of retaliation are things that we also want to protect against. So to minimize this risk, we really need to do two things. One is somehow protect our systems against these threats, the untrusted content, the potentially malicious content that we interact with. But also, we need to easily access the content without linking the research to ourselves or our employer. And that second one is probably the most important, really, for especially for the users, right? So there are a couple things there. If we break this apart, really what we're talking about are, to accomplish this, we have to understand how research and online activity can be tracked, develop mitigations to prevent that by improving our tradecraft, and do so in a secure but also easy to use manner. For those of you that have ever had to deal with security bureaucracy before, it's sometimes opposing, the security sometimes opposes the user's needs, right? And so many times efficiency or ease of use comes at a great cost to security. And that can be a big challenge, but there are ways to do that. So we're going to introduce today different ways of doing investigations online. But first, I want to understand, how are you today conducting your investigations or your online research, right? So a lot of people, for example, may be using their same computer and web browser as they use for their day-to-day work. There may be some folks that use incognito mode or private browsing that's enabled, or perhaps you use a VPN. So there's a poll that should be coming up now. Go ahead and submit a response, because it's always interesting when we do this. I ask this question quite a bit in a lot of these sessions, and the results are always a bit surprising to me, frankly. And, there's also a couple of options there where you have a separate computer or maybe a laptop using commercial Wi-Fi or free Wi-Fi that's out there. That's another solution that a lot of people try to use, especially if you don't have the resources. Maybe your organization's a bit small and under-resourced. That's possible too. All right, so we have about half of the folks here that have responded. So let's take a look and see what the results are. This initially was surprising to me when we first started doing these webinars, but now it's actually becoming more and more common. So a lot of people actually use the same computer and web browser to do their online investigation and online research as they do for their day-to-day work. Sometimes they use the same computer with a VPN in an attempt to hide the identity, or maybe they have incognito mode. And as you can see here, that's roughly about a little bit over half or so of the folks. Another 16 or 17% of folks have a separate computer with a separate internet connection that they use just for their research. And then we have some folks here that are using a managed attribution service, and we're going to discuss that a little bit later on as well. So why is this question important, and why are we even asking this, right? Well, let's look at the typical internet connection. This is what it looks like at a very, very high level. You have Firefox or Chrome installed, or perhaps Microsoft Edge installed on your workstation that's there at your organization or your employer, and you access the internet through your employer's internet connection, right? So that internet connection is assigned to your employer. They have a commercial internet provider that they go through to get that access to the internet, and you access all the data that you need. The thing is, though, it's not just web browsing, right? You also have data collection occurring in the background. So all of these websites that you visit, all of these services that you use on that same connection, on that same computer, there's data being continually collected, shared, and analyzed unbeknownst to you, right? And this can include things like your actual IP address, the internet address of your organization or your computer, the websites that you visit, and a bunch of settings that are actually very unique to you as a person and your computer and your organization. And these are really important because these data collections can actually be exploited by adversaries. They're very useful for advertising and to give us relevant ads and things like that, but they can also be exploited by adversaries or the targets of investigations. When we talk about tracking online, there are really three big buckets that we can put those into, right? The first is attributes of your internet connection and your internet address, things like the registered owner of your IP address or IP range, as well as attributes of your browser and your device. Every single web browser and device, they have different attributes that actually can be fingerprinted because they're so unique. Things like the operating system, the specific versions of software and plugins that are installed, as well as data that may be stored by websites. If you go to a shopping website, for example, they may store information about your preferences, or they may store information about your account in some way to uniquely tie you to that website. And that data can be harvested and collected and shared. There's also behavior, and this is one that a lot of people overlook. So things such as the times during which you use the internet, the types of search terms that you use, the social media connections that you may have, shopping interests and websites that you visit, all these things are stored and collected unbeknownst to most people. And these actually become very useful. Again, they're very useful for advertising, but in the wrong hands, this can actually be detrimental to online research and investigations. The point here that we're going to get into is that your web browser is not your friend. Chrome and Firefox and Edge, if you're using those today for your investigations, frankly, they're betraying you. They're betraying your trust. And here's why, right? Back in the 1990s, at the sort of the dawn of the graphical internet, Amazon.com looked something like this, right? You had essentially, you had text, you had links, and you had logos and images. And this was true for most commercial websites on the internet in maybe the mid 1990s. But as time grew on, it was no longer beneficial to only have a website that is static, right? This website was not customized for the user. You weren't able to necessarily log in and see your preferences and see different recommendations. And as the web has evolved, we have totally different experiences than we had, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. And so today, we actually have feature-rich, customized, and interactive experiences. If you go to Amazon.com today, for example, in this screenshot you see, they're recommending oatmeal. They say, hey, you just viewed this this collection of Quaker oatmeal because it knew that I was interested in that search term, right? I was looking for things to buy. Or maybe I had just started a movie and maybe I should continue watching it. Or perhaps it's going to suggest other topics or other products that may be of interest to me, which is pretty interesting, right? And from a consumer perspective, this is all super valuable. This is really great. And the downside to this, though, is that the websites have to share information and also must store information to provide this benefit to us. So if we continue on, your browser is useful, 100%, right? It's very, very useful, but it also betrays you, and that's a concern. Of course, the customization of websites is great because they can pull all this information from your web browser. Every time you visit a website, your web browser openly broadcasts this information to whichever website you visit. Whether or not you visited there previously, perhaps through a cookie. It also provides your device type, your operating system, your web browser type, and the exact version, even down to the third decimal place or so, right? Your language and your location, and any plugins or extensions that you have installed can also be cataloged by any website that you visit. And, so what, right? So what if somebody knows that, I use Firefox or I use Chrome and I have this particular version installed, or this is my time zone. Any one of these by themselves is not a big deal. But if you assemble each of these together, and now they have a group of attributes, together those attributes are very unique to you. And that is how someone can track you online and understand what you're doing online. So when you request a website, here's an example of what we're talking about. Of course, you have to say, hey, website, here's the domain name that I'm looking for, and here's the page that I want. Please give me this content. And along with that, not only you're asking for the website, you're telling the web server the operating system that you use, the exact browser version, and perhaps some plugins that are installed. And this is essentially to ensure compatibility with the content. Right. And so the website can use this to their benefit to provide content that is relevant, or perhaps to provide you different content depending on the type of device. If you're on a mobile device, for example, maybe if you're on an iPhone, it would display content in a different way or a different format than it would if you were visiting from a standard workstation. It also provides information on the language that you accept. So in this case, it's set to English in the United States, as well as the character set of your keyboard. This allows them to present information in different languages, for example. And we also have perhaps a cookie that's sent along with maybe a session ID. If you visit a shopping website, for example, it may store a shopping or a session ID on your workstation so that next time you go to that website, it has your preferences stored, it knows where you left off, or it may have information about your account that's readily available. Again, that's very beneficial, but perhaps it's also detrimental to us. Cookies are another way that you can be tracked, right? These are essentially small amounts of data that are stored on your computer by website. So something like that session ID or employee number or something like that. So that's actually a concern. There's also, more recently in the past couple of years, web and DOM storage. These are essentially work very similarly in that they store data on your computer, but larger amounts of data. So maybe something more about preferences or other information that's stored that can be relevant to enable certain features on a website. There's also canvas fingerprinting. So, let's say you go to a website and you don't even log in, right? Well, each individual component is different, right? So you may have the same exact computer as someone else, or the same model of computer as someone else, or you may have the same operating system as someone else. But there are tiny differences in the manufacturing and tolerances in each device. And so each device and each graphics card and each graphics piece of software, they all generate content in different ways. So when the website sends content back to the web browser then talks to the local computer to display and render that content on the screen. And these tiny inconsistencies in the components are actually creating tiny inconsistencies in the way in which things are drawn on the screen by the web browser. And by examining content or the output of this content and these rendering instructions, websites can actually fingerprint your device. And this is a way that they essentially can instruct the web browser to render a certain piece of text or a certain shape. And then they take a look at that shape and they see if there are differences that they can discern. And if so, those unique differences can now be applied similarly to a fingerprint, right? So they may not know your name or your address immediately, But over time, they can assemble that and understand that, this is your identity, this is your identifier, and then over time assemble that with other data that you may collect, that they may collect about you as time goes on. Also, things like audio and video devices, right? So your web browser actually can provide this information to websites that you visit. And this is all happening in the background, by the way. So a website may present content that asks the web browser to provide a list, for example, of audio and video devices. This is another way that you are unique. You may have a different sound card or a different microphone or a different audio driver, something like that, than someone else. And again, any one of these attributes alone is not a big deal. But when you start to assemble them together, it becomes very unique. Same thing with audio fingerprinting. This is similar to the canvas fingerprinting, but instead of drawing something on the screen and looking at small inconsistencies or small differences, they actually render some audio and then process that using your audio card. And they look at the inconsistencies and the differences in the way in which the audio is processed to find small variances. And those small variances can also be applied as a fingerprint. Also, things that are installed. So, for example, if you have fonts or extensions installed, these also can be used to uniquely identify you. You may have maybe you have a font that you've installed for some reason, for compatibility with something, and perhaps that font combined with other features could make your online presence very unique. Well, let's take a look. So if you're interested in this, and if this is maybe the first time that you're hearing about this, or if you are looking for a refresher, this is an excellent website that I direct people to. It's called amiunique.org. And if you have a cell phone, you can actually use it to open up the QR code there. It's a website that's free. It's run by a bunch of security researchers and fingerprinting researchers that are interested in this topic, right? They're collecting this data for interest in the topic. And they collect all these identifiers about your web browser and your local machine that your web browser exposes. And they actually determine how unique you are. So in this case, I used a MacBook Pro, a stock MacBook Pro off the shelf and with some updates installed. And as you can see, out of 3.2 million visitors to the website, they identified this MacBook Pro as being very unique. Meaning that, and if it's unique, that means you can track it more easily, right? You can determine who the person is and track that data, or track those sessions across different websites. And that's just by assembling the operating system, the type of browser, the browser version, the time zone, the language, and other attributes together, right? So again, any one of these, by themselves may not be a big deal. So for example, you may have 11% of people maybe use a Mac, but a Mac combined with the Chrome, combined with the specific version of Chrome and the time zone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you become more and more unique. And all of this can happen in the background unbeknownst to you. And so that's really the point here. You and your device are not at all unique. At least we hope that we're not, right? But really we are. The goal is we don't want to be unique when we're online, but really we are. And we are unique because the web browser that we use actually betrays our privacy. And the takeaway here is that even without logging in, websites can access all this information. But wait, there's more. If you do log in, additional data is collected, right? So one of the resources online is social media, right? So if you log on to social media and you're doing some research there for an investigation, again, it doesn't matter if you're doing a financial fraud investigation for a financial firm or perhaps a local law enforcement investigation or even open source intelligence and research, all of this stuff applies. So you have to go on to a social media site to collect information for your purpose. And, some of those require a login to view, but even if you don't log in, they still track you, by the way. So have you ever gone to a news website or maybe a newspaper or something like that, and you see a like or a share button right beside the article? We've all seen that, right? What's happening there in the background is there's code embedded from social media sites within those websites to enable that functionality to like and to share and things like that. And so on the back end, the various social media platforms know the sites that you visit, and they collect certain data on that. So for example, maybe you go to a website, you have a specific search term, they may collect that. They may also collect the fact that you placed an item in your shopping cart, but you didn't check out. This is very valuable, right? Because then you can, in addition to getting advertising and emails from the shopping website itself, on social media, perhaps then you could get advertising specific to that product to remind you to go back and finish the checkout process. Again, that's very valuable and sometimes helpful to us as consumers. But this is happening on a massive scale. And so if we look at this, this is actually from a Facebook account. And you see here there are a bunch of websites that have shared information about this user's behavior with the Facebook application, and it's all being aggregated together. Now, individually, somebody has an aviation interest, or they're looking at news in Denver, or they're shopping at Galls for some law enforcement equipment, and they have an AT&T account. Lots of people have AT&T accounts. Lots of people have an interest in aviation or law enforcement, but all of these together pinpoint a person, right? So someone with aviation interest, probably in Denver area or maybe the DC area. They are in law enforcement. They have an AT&T account. They have a firearms interest. They have a perhaps real estate investing interest. That starts to narrow down the type of person that this could be associated with. Same thing with the organization, right? It's quite possible that they're involved in law enforcement or investigations in some way, which may also tip people off. If you want to see what this looks like for yourself, go into your Facebook account. This is an example from Facebook, so just go in there, go to settings, go to your Facebook information, and the term here is off Facebook activity. And you can actually click the manage button and see exactly what websites are sharing and collaborating there to store information about you and your habits online. If this sounds a bit overwhelming and it sounds a bit surprising to you, don't worry, it's surprising to everyone. We conduct surveys with a lot of people, just like we did at the beginning of this. And the ones that we do for specific to law enforcement, we found that actually 98% of investigators and criminal analysts and law enforcement officers that go online, or they have to go online to conduct research. So 98% of the attendees have gone online to do research for their investigations, but 73% of them, which is a large majority, lack the security and privacy controls and precautions and things like that. So overwhelmingly, we see this as an issue where I think there's a big issue there of probably just not knowing about this tracking happening in the background. So let's think for a bit about the impact of this. Let's say that you're an investigator and you're working on a team at a corporation doing threat and security research, right? And you get an anonymous tip that someone is planning to do something. They're infiltrating some kind of private event that you're building, and they're doing all the planning and research on social media. So as a corporate security guy, you're trying to confirm this information, trying to maybe run down that lead and collect new information for your investigation and possibly hand it off to someone else. So knowing what we know now about how data is shared and how this changes, how can the research methods that are employed possibly affect the investigation? So let's run this down a little bit. Let's say that, as a corporate security officer or a corporate threat team, maybe a trust and safety team at a tech company, right? You start running down this lead. So you go on to, let's say, Facebook or some other social media site, and you see the information that's there. Maybe they're planning it in a Facebook group or something like that. And you collect that information and you decide to pass it off to maybe your local law enforcement for further action. Well, now they have to do the same thing. They go on there and they start looking at this too. Well, the results of that can be pretty astounding, unfortunately. So here's an example of a mock-up, right? So Hans Gruber is posting his very evil plans and dirty deeds done dirt cheap. And hey, it's good to go for Saturday. And then maybe he posts an update and says, hey, let's hold off on things. I'm getting some weird friend requests. So if you're a law enforcement officer, it'd be pretty embarrassing if the target of your investigation starts getting friend suggestions for yourself or your coworkers, right? And this is kind of a funny example from the movie Die Hard, if folks are fans of Die Hard. And it's kind of a lighthearted example, but it's very, very real, right? So for example, we have a number of cases where actual police departments have received warning letters from Facebook against using online research accounts that they've developed. And this is because it's so easy to identify fake accounts and inauthentic activity. And also we have examples of reporters, for example, that have, unfortunately, they've started receiving friend suggestions from what they thought were confidential or anonymous sources that were feeding them information. So you may think that you're being anonymous, you may think that you're being confidential, but there's a lot more going on in the background, as we've discussed. So this presents a problem, right? How do we perform the research we need to perform without attributing it back to our employer, right? A number of ways that we can do that. So there's incognito mode and VPN. These have actually become increasingly popular, I think, over the past year with work from home. So people may be doing the research from home or on a personal device even. Unfortunately, all that data from the personal device is already associated with you as a person. And so now you're associating that research activity with your employer and you, right? So, and that's obviously not a good thing, because that's when some negative consequences can take place. So people try to use a private option in the browser, in incognito mode, or there's 2 terms that are used. That's essentially, it helps, but it doesn't stop the tracking that we've just talked about, right? The web browser betraying your trust and giving up information about you without your control. It's better than nothing, but it is not very helpful and can still impede investigations. There's also virtual private networks, so VPNs, or perhaps going down to the local McDonald's or Starbucks and using some free Wi-Fi. Yes, that can provide you a veil of anonymity, and it's better than using maybe your own home connection that's directly tied to you. But really, the browsing is still attributed by those behaviors and the browsing history and all those attributes that the web browser talks about to all of the different websites. Your web browser is essentially betraying your trust and telling everyone all these different attributes about you behind your back. It also, the other thing to mention here is that sort of that first bit of information that we talked about early on was we want to protect our own systems, right? So none of these protect against malware infection or things like that. If anything, at the best, they may partially obfuscate you for just a very limited amount of time, but they're really not a good solution. There are also solutions out there called maybe non-attributable systems, non-attribution systems, or misattributable systems. And these can come in different flavors and forms. They can be services. They could also be perhaps a standalone network with sometimes it's called a dirty connection out to the internet. And this can be helpful, but it's important to know a couple of things. When we talk about non-attribution, when you hear that term, it's a bit of a dated term now, but that's essentially making sure that the activity is not tied to anyone. It's not tied to any specific person or entity, and that you would be completely anonymous online. As we've shown today, your browsing habits, all this other data that's collected about you, that makes that nearly impossible. You'll probably be attributed to some kind of entity or organization without a lot of work, right? So if you're an organization that has maybe purchased a separate standalone internet connection, and you have a separate standalone network or computers, just be advised that over time, the attribution or the misattribution or non-attribution can actually erode and then betray your trust as well. There's also misattribution. That is a term that is commonly used. That's essentially pretending to be someone else. And so that's essentially throwing out some false information to sort of misrepresent certain things. And that may be using a different network address. So a VPN is an example of partial misattribution. It's not a full solution, obviously, but obfuscating your network address or obfuscating data that may be saved. Getting rid of the cookies at the end of a session, or changing those browser-related attributes. Now, the other solution is managed attribution. This is probably a subset, really, of misattribution, and it's more of a modern term just within the past few years. This gives you all the benefits of misattribution, but in a nice, controlled, easy-to-use way. And this is the ability to easily customize how you appear. Depending on the research that you want to do, you can tailor and customize your browser fingerprints, so things like the time zone, the language, the keyboard, the operating system device, all those things that we mentioned earlier that give you up. You can customize how you appear depending on the needs of your investigation. There's also the network address, the ability to choose the global or the region, right? The global region where you appear from. That's an important piece of this as well. If you're investigating perhaps maybe financial fraud and there's a tie to Asia, maybe you want to appear like you're coming out of a network node within Singapore, for example. You get the idea there. And also data transfer and protection, right? So you want to make sure that whatever your solution is, that you're able to start fresh every single time with an isolated session that is not tied to your corporate network or your organization's network with no persistent tracking. So you want those cookies to be cleared out every time to make sure that you have a nice clean slate every time you need to use it. That's actually what we do, by the way. So this is not necessarily a sales webinar, but that is actually what we do. So we have what we call Managed Attribution as a service. This is where you can actually use the same computer that you use every day for research, but the web browser that you use is a different web browser, and that actually connects to a service such as Silo, for example. That's the name of our service. And this allows you to very easily cloak and customize how you appear to websites. Choose your internet egress point that is applicable to your investigation, and it completely isolates the web browsing from your local network to prevent malware infection, to prevent websites identifying you based on your workstation attributes and files and things like that, but also provides a full and complete audit trail. So that's a very quick rundown of how the browser betrays you, some of the security concerns and how they can affect online investigations, as well as some solutions here towards the end, different options for employing some good, strong tradecraft. So the takeaways from this, really remember that take advantage of the information that's out there. Don't be afraid to go out there and do research. You have to do the research, and it's imperative that you access the tools and the resources that are available online when you need them, right? So you need a solution that will move very quickly, but also preserve the security. And by security, number two, right, beware of the tracking mechanisms that are out there and the fingerprint that you leave behind. That's incredibly important, because if you don't do that, then you can have disastrous results for your investigation. This is especially important if you're using the same computer and the same web browser that you use for other things. If you're accessing your employer's intranet and employer-related files and resources on the same computer and same web browser that you're using to go maybe search social media for a suspect, that can be very damaging. And number three, make sure you safely do this, right? So separate your personal browsing from the work-related browsing and the research that you do, and also use tools that are out there and services to enable managed attribution. I just want to point out that there is a request a demo button there. So if you're interested at all in managed attribution and the Silo solution and how we can assist your organization or you as an investigator or researcher, please get into contact with us. Click that request a demo button, and we'll be happy to. Now we'll move on to the Q&A. I look here at the inbox, and we have quite a few questions. So I'll turn it back over to Julie. If you have additional questions that you want to get answered, we're happy to do that now. Feel free to ask a question in the Q&A box. And over to Julie.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Matt. It looks like we're getting quite a few questions. So we'll answer as many as we can. And if you've asked a question that we aren't able to answer, we'll reach out to you and make sure that gets answered offline. So let's see. Let's start with this one. And I think you may have touched on it, but I just want to make sure we may as well highlight it again because it's a good question. From Philip, in today's environment, most of us are working from home with a laptop from work and an employer VPN on a home Wi-Fi. How does that affect research?
Man, that's a great question, and it's one that we get pretty often, especially given the past year, right, of heavy use of remote work. So if you're using an employer-provided VPN that's on an employer-provided laptop and you're connecting to your home Wi-Fi, the risk there is really twofold. One is you're still doing research that's attributable to your employer, even if it goes through the VPN and goes out your normal corporate or government connection back at the organization that you work for. That can still be attributable and is attributable back to your organization. The second thing that I would worry about there is that if the VPN is disconnected in some way, or perhaps it's not enabled, right? You can't get back to your organization's files and your organization's websites, but perhaps you can still go out to the internet. So in some cases, depending on the VPN configuration, if you're accessing something on the open internet, it may not go through the VPN. And in that case, there's an additional risk, though, of associated that activity that you're doing with your own home network and your home computer or your home devices and things like that, right? That can be a big problem. And I'd say probably the third thing too with that too is if you're using the same computer and you're accessing any personal website. So if you're going to your personal email account or your personal Facebook or Twitter account that have your name associated with it, just kind of beware of that, right? Or if you're doing online shopping on Amazon, for example, on the same computer or on the same browser, just beware that that information on the back end is being collected somewhere and is being associated.
Great. Okay, let's see. Are searches made on phones like iPhones more secure than those made on laptops or desktops?
That's a great question. So yes and no. In many ways, the cell phones are a really convenient way to do research, right? So I see this a lot with, especially with agencies that have an immediate need to go research something, right? And perhaps their IT policies at their organization are blocking the content. Maybe there's content filtering or something like that because the content they need to view may be inappropriate for their workplace. So there's an IT filter that's blocking that. That's a really common problem. So many people turn to their phones. And when you turn to your phone, you can very quickly get the content and it's safe and secure, or at least it appears that way. But again, it comes with the same risks, right? Because the websites that you visit on your phone, they use many of the same tracking mechanisms, right? So just beware of that. And while malware for laptop computers and workstations, that's more common. There is malware out there that targets specific phones and types of phones and things like that. So while it may be good in the sense that it's a quick solution, just beware that there is risk with that, and it comes along with the same tracking mechanisms as everything else.
Great. Okay, here's another one from Justin. How would Silo eliminate its own unique identifiers when investigating online? Would not the use of software such as Silo still result in similar identifiers being relatable? Just not as specific or in-depth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what Silo allows you to do is actually customize how you appear online. And so it's the customization that allows us to call it managed attribution. You're still attributed in some way to something, but you control how you appear. So rather than having no choice by having a web browser that's sort of static with those fields, you can actually customize the attributes. So the idea there is not necessarily to be non-attributable, right? Because it's impossible really to be completely anonymous, but you want to blend in with the traffic and misattribute your traffic so that it doesn't look like something that your employer is doing necessarily.
Great. Okay, from Brock, how does Silo handle public IP addressing on their egress nodes so untrusted content owners can't block authenticate's public IP addresses ranges?
Man, that's a great question too. So the short answer, without getting into proprietary information, is that we have various methods that we have in place to acquire the public IP address space and infrastructure so that they're not associated with us, right? And that's a very common problem that you mentioned there, right? So that's another problem with going with a VPN solution. If you go with a VPN, it may provide you some level of access, but the VPN public IP ranges are very, very quickly identified as VPNs. And so that's also the benefit of Silo, is that we're not on blacklists and we monitor for that sort of thing. So we have proactive measures that we have in place to make sure that doesn't happen. Great.
From Joe, how does Tor impact attribution?
That's a great question. So I think with Tor, right? I didn't mention it in the presentation just now because there's a whole nother presentation that we can do on the dark web. And actually we have one coming up on April 29th. So if you're interested in the dark web, definitely check out the webinar and sign up for that on April 29th. But the idea here is that Tor is a way to anonymize your traffic, right? So at a very high level, the traffic originates on your workstation through a special browser, and then it bounces around through multiple hot points before it goes to an exit node, which then gets the content from whatever website. it's actually really great for anonymity. So it's actually a really, really great tool for that. The downside and the risk is that, one, there's a security risk, right? So if you're accessing these websites with untrusted content, especially if you're going into the dark web forums and things like that, there's a high likelihood that you can stumble across either objectionable content that shouldn't be on your local workstation or malicious content that can actually impede your investigation further by infecting your workstation or infecting your employer in some way. And we've seen the rise of ransomware, for example, is a big challenge that a lot of state and local governments and financial institutions are facing. So you don't want your investigation to put your organization at risk, right, from a cybersecurity perspective. So those are the big concerns there. I would also add that secondary to that, you have the risk of attribution, not necessarily from the IP address and things like that, but more from your behavior online. So if you access certain websites in a certain pattern, or if you have linguistic patterns, right? That's another thing that people oftentimes forget about. The way you speak online and the way that you type online, those are very unique to you, as well as the browsing habits and the patterns of activity. All of those things can eventually be tied back to you and cataloged.
Great. Okay, we're getting a lot of questions. Keep asking. We've got a little bit more time. So would you recommend using Tor with a managed attribute and using a VPN, or can you eliminate something using an OS like Cubes, Wonks, or Tails? I'm sure I mispronounced that. I apologize.
No, that's okay, Julie. Yeah. So yeah, the question is basically, would you recommend using Tor with Managed Attribution solution, or can you use with some other operating systems, right, that are out there for this purpose? So thank you, Chuck, for the question. The short answer is, I'm a bit biased here, but I think the right answer here is with a Managed Attribution service for a couple of reasons. One is if you're an organization that has a mature IT security policy, they probably block Tor today or aren't able to monitor the traffic in a way that ensures the security of the internal network, right? So you want to make sure your organization is secure and respect that. So that's one problem that can be introduced. There's also the administrative tail that comes with standing up a separate solution, and you have to operate and maintain that and patch that and make sure that it's secure. You also have to have auditing and monitoring all these things that are built in or that should be built in. With a managed attribution solution like Silo, for example, you can access the dark web using Tor without any of the headache, right? So it's literally just point, click, open it up, and you're right there and you're on it. So and it comes with that isolation layer, right? So any of the data that you view can't harm the local workstation. So you get the access that you need without any of the risks. So I'm partial, of course, but I would have to say Silo is a good solution for that.
Great. And just as a reminder, these slides from today's presentation are already available as a PDF in the resources list on the right side. And we will be sending out a recording, so don't worry. You can go back and refer to the presentation later, but we'll be sending that out in the next couple of days for everyone that has registered. So a couple more questions, Matt. Why would you want to use Silo to access your bank account or Facebook account?
Good question. So in that case, the biggest benefit that you get there is not from the managed attribution aspect. It's more of a security benefit that you would get. So obviously, if you're logging into a website like Facebook or your bank account, you're associating your identity with that session. So you're not really gaining anything from a managed attribution perspective, but you may gain some security benefits. So if you're accessing Facebook or some other website and you're trying to access information, then perhaps you get a security benefit from the isolation that's there. The other benefit potentially is that in more advanced scenarios where you're trying to access these websites or trying to access online banking from maybe an untrusted device, right? Maybe you're trying to access it from some kind of shared computer, like at a public library, for example, right? You're trying to access these personal sites. You can actually access a web version of Silo web client without installing it, right? Access the web client and browse that way. That may provide you some additional reassurance that there's no data that is resident on the computer after you leave. So a couple of different benefits there that are slightly different from this typical managed attribution.
Great. All right, a couple of more. What is your opinion on the use of burner accounts? Would this be a useful way, for instance, to conduct social media research?
So yeah, burner accounts, depending on how you define that, right? They can be very useful, and you a lot of times see this with law enforcement investigations, for example, where perhaps they have to go online and they're trying to get into a certain group, a discussion, or a certain forum, right? These can be very tricky. They can also be very time-consuming. They're not an easy thing to do, at least not to do it well. So if you're trying to go online and under the persona of someone else, or a persona that you've created, you have to maintain that persona, right? So sure, you can go ahead and create an account under a fake name or a fake address or a fake profile photo, all those things. But for it to be really effective, there's a lot of administrative burden that comes along with that. So they can be very effective, but they require a lot of upkeep, right? So you have to have a reason, for example, like if it was just recently created, that raises the suspicion of anyone seeing that account. So there's a lot of care and feeding that has to go into those accounts. And you have to make sure that with managed attribution that you maintain a consistent profile, right? So if those accounts are accessing websites in a certain manner from a certain time zone, you don't want to deviate from that too much, right? So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is consistent, and managed attribution is one of the ways that you can do that. You just have to be careful and just be aware of the considerations that are there.
Great. Let's see. Does use of tools like Silo cause issues when you might be using stock puppet social media accounts? Should you use a standard setup for each stock puppet?
Oh man, that's probably a question that deserves a separate session, and that's kind of related to the previous question too. I would stay away from, in general, though, I'll answer, in general, I would stay away from trying to have sort of a standard or a stock profile or that sort of thing, because you have to consider that anything that's consistent across those profiles, if an adversary were to discover whatever that attribute or that trait is, they can then possibly use that to identify your other profiles. So if there is a certain pattern to the username, for example, I've seen that in the past with some folks that are online. They're pretty easy to spot in some ways. And you see this a lot with propaganda accounts. There have been a lot of open source research into, for example, nation state propaganda, especially last year leading up to the election, and what that looked like. And sometimes there are certain patterns to the usernames. And that's very useful if you're trying to script the creation of these things. But they can also be used once you identify the pattern. You can then go find very similar accounts and potentially block those or take other kind of enforcement action. So.
Great. I think we're getting a ton more questions, but I think it's probably good we'll wrap it up. We'll go through those questions and make sure that they're all answered for everyone. Since we've had so many questions and responses from this webinar, we could potentially do a blog answering all those questions and let everybody know all the great questions that have been asked, and send that out to all registrants in the future. So I just want to do a reminder, if you liked the content today, please go ahead and fill out our survey. We'd love to hear what you thought. Let us know any topics you'd like to see in the future. That's how we're coming up with our webinar content in the near future. And as you can see on the screen, we do have 3 coming up. We have a part 2 to this one. So if you want to hear more about managed attribution, go ahead and sign up for that Making Exposed part 2, which will be on May 13th. And then coming up next week is trust and safety for those that are on trust and safety teams. Be sure to register for that one. And then the last one, and Matt pointed out this, is the intro to the dark web. So if you have any questions about that, that would be a great webinar to make sure you attend on April 29th. All of the boxes below the slides, you can register in any one of those or all of them if you like, and we will send you out a calendar reminder to block that for the future. So thank you for attending. We appreciate your time today. And with that, we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, everyone.